This video will cover the kidneys and the urinary system. The learning objectives that we'll cover include the organs of the renal or urinary system, the kidneys and how the kidneys work to filter blood and create urine, and also we'll finish up with some clinical measurements that can tell us if the kidneys are working. So first we're going to list the organs of the urinary or renal system. We start with the kidneys. The kidneys actually receive quite a bit of our cardiac output, and they filter some of that blood, and that filtrate is processed to create urine. Once the urine is produced by the kidneys, it's actually funneled down to a tube called the ureters. The ureters lead to your bladder. The funnel that leads into the ureter is called the renal pelvis. So that urine makes its way into the renal pelvis, down the muscular tubed ureters, and into the bladder. Once in the bladder, the urine is stored until you actually will urinate and push that urine out using the muscular bladder. So again, here is our urinary system. Inside the abdominal cavity, we have the kidneys leading down to the bladder via the ureters. We have our bladder, which actually has a transitional epithelium lining. And pretty much the bladder can be thought of as a muscular pouch. So we have lots of collagen and elastin connective tissue, and then we have lots of smooth muscle. The ureter actually leads to another tube called the urethra, and the urethra carries the urine from the bladder out of the body. We also have some control of our bladder using sphincters. We have an internal urethral sphincter made out of the smooth muscle of the bladder, and we have a skeletal muscle sphincter called the external urethral sphincter, which is basically the skeletal muscle of your pelvic floor. Of course, we control the skeletal muscle sphincter, and our autonomic nervous system will control our bladder. I mentioned the transitional epithelium that lines the bladder, as well as the ureter and some of the renal pelvis. There's the smooth muscle in the wall of the bladder. Sometimes it's called the detrusor muscle. So all day long you're filling up your bladder with urine, and it stays relaxed until you want to go and actually causes that bladder to contract and pushes the urine out. When I was looking for a textbook diagram of the urinary anatomy, I noticed that this textbook guy looked a lot like former NFL quarterback and current ESPN analyst Steve Young. I thought it was kind of funny. Okay, so next we're going to discuss the role of the kidneys in homeostasis. So whenever we think of homeostasis, usually the brain's in charge of it, and somewhat the brain will be in charge of our kidneys, but in a lot of ways our kidneys are in charge of homeostasis for a lot of different variables besides just producing urine. So one of the things to keep in mind is that when we talked about arterial blood pressure, we thought about it mostly as our blood vessels and our heart. So our heart pumping and creating that arterial blood pressure. We talked about heart rate and total peripheral resistance. Well, if you think about it, since your kidneys are actually filtering that arterial blood by controlling how much fluid stays in your body and controlling your blood volume, the kidneys actually have quite a bit of impact on your blood pressure. And we'll talk more about that in our next lecture. So the kidneys are important in regulating your blood pressure. Sometimes they'll conserve fluid and keep fluid in the body, which helps your blood pressure. Other times they can pee out ions like water and chloride and sodium, and that'll cause your blood pressure to decrease. The other thing that the kidneys are important in regulating is the osmolarity, or concentration of your body's fluid. So this includes not only your extracellular fluid, but also the fluid in your blood. So one of the things to think about is the osmolarity, or concentration of pure water, is very, very low, right? There's not a lot of things floating around in that water, so we call it having a low osmolarity. If we take things like sodium and chloride and calcium and glucose, and we take those and dissolve those in the water, it actually changes the osmolarity. So we call those things solutes when we dissolve them in water. The more solutes you have dissolved in the water, the higher the osmolarity, or the higher the concentration is. So it's important to regulate the osmolarity of the body to keep our little cells happy. The ideal osmolarity is about 300 inside our body, and this is good because it keeps your cells from shrinking or swelling. So how did the kidneys get involved in this? Well, if you ever take in too much salt and chloride, it can increase your osmolarity. That would cause your little cells to lose water. And so one of the things the kidneys can help us do is then to pee out any of that extra salt and chloride and get rid of that, lowering your osmolarity back down to normal. Again, the kidneys do this by filtering your blood, which is an extension of your body fluid, and so they're able to regulate the osmolarity. All right, so it's important to maintain your osmolarity to keep your cells from shrinking or swelling. I also wanted to remind us that the kidneys make hormones, so we've learned that the kidneys can actually sense the oxygen floating around in our blood and release a hormone called erythropoietin, which stimulates hematopoietic stem cells in our bone marrow, and that will increase the number of red blood cells circulating in our bloodstream. We also learned long ago about vitamin D3 and how it gets activated and becomes calcitriol in the kidneys, which can regulate blood calcium and the strength of your bones. So our kidneys are all day long are filtering our blood, and so we get quite a bit of blood flowing to our kidneys. The kidneys are then able to filter that blood and remove waste products and excrete those waste products into our urine, which then leaves our body. So some of those waste products we'll cover now. For example, protein metabolism causes the production of ammonia and ammonium ions. The liver and other cells in the body can take that ammonia and somewhat detoxify it to create urea. Urea then can be peed out through your kidneys. Another metabolic byproduct of skeletal muscle is called creatinine, and so creatinine is made all day long by your skeletal muscles. This filters in the kidneys and then can be peed out in the urine. We'll learn that creatinine is a really good marker of renal function. There's other waste products such as uric acid, which comes from the breakdown of nucleic acids. There's also things from heme metabolism, which we learned before, and one of those things is bilirubin. Another one is urobilin. Urobilin can actually be peed out and filtered and then peed out really easily by the kidneys. Urobilin apparently gives pee some of its yellow color. If you've ever ate asparagus, you notice that asparagus, once it's digested, it releases some chemicals that are concentrated in your urine, which can make your urine smell quite interesting. So again, the kidneys all day long are able to get things out of our body from our blood and from our body fluid. The kidneys are also important in regulating your pH, which, if you remember, your pH has to do with your hydrogen ion concentration. If you ever become too acidic with too many little hydrogen ions, luckily your kidneys can help pee out those hydrogen ions, as well as reabsorb and keep bicarbonate in the body, which can act as a buffer. So by regulating hydrogen ion and bicarbonate, the kidneys can help in regulating our body's pH. Also, the lungs, we learned, had an important role in pH by regulating CO2. So between the lungs and the kidneys, you can maintain the perfect pH in your body. So what happens if the kidneys stop doing their job? What happens if the kidneys fail? So one of the problems you're going to have is to be able to get rid of things out of your body that you need to. So if you thought of the swimming pool as your body's fluid, when your kidneys are working, they keep the composition of the swimming pool perfect for your body. When the kidneys fail, all of a sudden things start to build up. Metabolic byproducts, waste products, even simple things like sodium and potassium, chloride, water can start to build up to dangerous levels inside the body. The next learning objective we'll cover is to describe the regulation of the bladder in micturition, which is really just a fancy way for saying urination. So since your kidneys are making urine all day long, they never stop, even when you sleep, we're always constantly filling our bladder to some extent. And so most of the time we're filling our bladder, and then every once in a while, when we voluntarily initiate urination, we actually go and push urine out. So this relies on the smooth muscle cells of the bladder wall, which are often called the detrusor muscle. The neck of the bladder where it leads into the urethra is called the internal urethral sphincter. Again, that smooth muscle. We also have the skeletal muscle floor of our pelvis, which the urethra passes through. That's called the external urethral sphincter. So again, when we look at our bladder, and our urethra here. Our bladder is lined by epithelium. If you remember it from lab, it's transitional epithelium, and so it's stacked layers, so we call it stratified transitional. If we were to use a microscope to zoom in and look at the actual tissue layer showing the epithelium of the bladder, we could actually see the cuboidal and columnar cells all stacked up on each other. And again, we have a basement membrane and connective tissue supporting that epithelium. So again, our urinary bladder epithelium is transitional. Sometimes you might hear of something called the transitional carcinoma or transitional cell carcinoma. That would probably involve your bladder or your kidneys. Okay, so we have afferent neurons that innervate our bladder wall that can actually give information to your brain whenever your bladder is starting to get full. And we're going to have our autonomic nervous system control our bladder. So for example, we have sympathetic neurons which actually go to the bladder wall and control the smooth muscle of not only the bladder wall but that internal urethral sphincter using the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. The important thing for the sympathetic neurons is to cause those smooth muscle cells to relax, which allows our bladder to increase in volume and we can fill our bladder with more urine. So the sympathetic nervous system is all about filling our bladder by making smooth muscle cells relax. It keeps the internal urethral sphincter contracted. What about our parasympathetic neurons? They're actually going to innervate the same places in the bladder, and these neurons are actually going to release acetylcholine. And so acetylcholine is going to cause the smooth muscle cells of our bladder to actually contract. If we look at the internal urethral sphincter, those parasympathetic neurons are actually going to cause that to relax. But the primary effect of activating your parasympathetic neurons to your bladder is going to cause that bladder to contract, which is going to help push urine out of your bladder. If you're wondering where your own control comes in micturition, remember that you have control of that skeletal muscle pelvic floor, which creates the external urethral sphincter. And since you can voluntarily relax that, you actually initiate sort of a reflex activation of the autonomic nervous system. And so that way you can control urination or micturition. So remember, the parasympathetic nervous system, its job is to activate and contract those little smooth muscle cells, causing you to empty your bladder. If we think about the control of our bladder, we need to have sensations that go up our spinal cord that give us sort of knowledge about when our bladder is full. We also have wiring that goes from our spinal cord to our bladder, and then wiring that goes up and down our spinal cord to control those lower neurons. So if you ever have spinal cord injury, you'll lose not only sensation from your bladder, but probably lose that voluntary control of urination. You still may have reflexive contraction of the bladder and some spastic contraction of the bladder, which can cause urination. So just to summarize, remember your parasympathetic nervous system is all about rest, digest, and peeing, and so that helps contract the bladder. The sympathetic nervous system is about fight, flight, and exercise, which actually helps relax the bladder and helps in filling the bladder. If you have an overactive bladder, you might want to take medication to relax that bladder. One of the ways you can relax that bladder and prevent an overactive bladder and accidentally urinating is to take an acetylcholine receptor blocker or a norepinephrine receptor agonist or activator. Either of those will help promote sort of a relaxation of your bladder. Next, we're going to describe GFR and the mechanisms of urine formation. If we think about our heart, it's pumping blood to our kidneys all day long. And so of that blood that enters into the kidneys, a portion of it will actually filter from your blood vessels into these tiny little tubes called nephrons in the kidneys. An even smaller portion of that filtered fluid will actually be excreted out of the body as urine. I think if we look at some numbers, you'll get a better idea of how the kidneys work. So if we consider that our kidneys, the two kidneys together, receive a total of about 1,000 mils of blood per minute. If we consider the typical human with a hematocrit of about 50%, it means that about half of that blood is big stuff like red blood cells and white blood cells, and that kind of stuff can't really filter. But the other half, about 500 mils, is plasma, and plasma is actually stuff that can filter. how much of that 500 mils of plasma per minute actually filters in the kidney, a good number to remember is about 100 mils per minute. So about 100 mils per minute of your total blood that comes in is actually filtered. So when we actually consider how much urine you form, it's actually a small amount. It's only about 1 mil per minute under normal circumstances. So what happens to that other 99 mils? Well, if we think about it, 1,000 mils of blood entered our kidney, 999 mils of blood are leaving, and so we actually only took a small portion and excreted it from our kidneys. So it tells us that most of what filters must be reabsorbed, right? These valuable things like water and sodium and glucose, calcium, all need to be reabsorbed by the kidney after filtration, and then a small amount of water and ions and waste products are actually excreted. So if we think about it, the kidneys filter lots of blood. So they get lots and lots of blood, about 1,000 mils per minute. Only about half of that blood as plasma is actually filterable. Of that plasma, only about 20% is filtered, 100 mils per minute. We call that GFR, after the glomerulus, where it actually filters. Of that 100 mils that filters, only about 1 mil is actually excreted in urine. So most of everything that filters is automatically reabsorbed. Again, all that stuff is useful, and so the body wants to keep it in the body, only excreting a small amount of waste and ions and water in our urine. Okay, in order to understand the kidney, we need to get small and look at some of the action that's happening with filtration, reabsorption, and finally urine formation. So if we zoom in on our kidney, we can actually see these tiny little sets of tubes which are going to help in urine formation. First thing to consider is there's about 2 million of these little sets of tubes called nephrons. The nephrons are basically simple cuboidal epithelial cells, but they have an associated group of blood vessels which create a functional unit of our kidney. So remember, we have blood flow into these tiny little blood vessels, and eventually we reach an afferent arteriole, which controls blood flow into a set of capillaries called the glomerular capillary. The glomerular capillary is actually where filtration takes place. There's a capsule of simple squamous epithelial cells which capture the filtrate, and so we call that structure the glomerulus. So we take that filtrate, and that filtrate then is funneled through a set of simple cuboidal epithelial cells called the nephron. If you want to think of the filtrate, think of it as pre-urine. So the filtrate snakes its way through this set of simple cuboidal epithelial cells. All along the way, the little epithelial cells do their job of reabsorption, grabbing things like water and sodium and chloride and potassium, amino acids and glucose, everything valuable that's filtered out of our blood, but we want to keep in our body. So those little epithelial cells have to reabsorb all these things. Once in the tissue space of the kidneys, then they're picked up by reabsorption capillaries. One of these sets of capillaries are called the peritubular capillaries. Another set we'll learn is called the vasorectal capillaries. So as the filtrate moves through, some of those epithelial cells will help reabsorb water. Other epithelial cells might help reabsorb ions like sodium and chloride and potassium. We'll also have parts of this nephron that are sensitive to hormones, which can then regulate the body's fluid or salt balance. So decide whether you should pick up ions or let them go out in your urine, pick up water and reabsorb it, or let it go out in your urine. Finally, when that filtrate reaches the end of the nephron, it's considered urine. And so that's how you form urine. And then remember, all those things that you reabsorbed make their way out of the kidneys in the blood flow out. So remember, the glomerulus, or the glomerular capillaries, where filtration takes place. The rest of the nephron processes that filtrate. Most of the time, we're just reabsorbing everything that filtered, taking it from the nephron filtrate and adding it back to those blood capillaries, which will then continue on to venules and veins and keep that stuff inside our body. All right, so one of the things to think about is the glomerular capillary is where this filtration takes place. And so in order to understand how that filtration takes place, one of the things we need to think about is the blood flow into that glomerular capillary is controlled by the afferent arteriole, But then there's an exiting or efferent arteriole which controls blood flow out of that capillary bed. This is pretty unique, and it actually helps increase the capillary pressure, which helps promote filtration and leaking of the fluid out of that capillary. So when we talk about the kidneys, the afferent and efferent arterioles not only help regulate renal blood flow, they also help regulate GFR, which stands for glomerular filtration rate. If we think that our kidneys have 2 million of these little nephrons and glomerular capillaries, the total filtration adds up to be about 100 mils per minute. So the blood flows through the afferent arterioles and into the glomerular capillaries. Those glomerular capillaries aren't alone in there. They actually have these little podocyte cells which hug the capillary endothelial cells, and they actually help create this unique barrier between the two cells. The other thing to remember is that the fluid leaks out through this filtration barrier of cells. We call that fluid filtrate. Most of the blood flow, though, doesn't leak out and doesn't filter and flows out of the glomerular capillary through the efferent arteriole. We can also regulate renal blood flow using our sympathetic nervous system. Those neurons release norepinephrine, which cause the afferent arteriole to vasoconstrict, which decreases renal blood flow and would also decrease GFR. So remember, we get this filtrate formed, this fluid that moves through our glomerular capillary filter. It's captured in this space called Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule is really just a sheet of simple squamous epithelial cells which capture the filtrate as it leaks out of the glomerular capillary. All right, so let's zoom in and actually look at how we create this barrier for. Again, it involves the glomerular capillary, which is made of endothelial cells. Those endothelial cells obviously are sort of wrapped up like a little tube, which traps the blood and the plasma inside the capillary. We also have some connective tissue, a basement membrane supporting those endothelial cells, things like collagen. We also notice that these endothelial cells have these little holes or fenestrations. This helps them be a better filter and allows them to leak more fluid. Finally, we add those little octopus cells, those little helper cells called podocytes, which hug the endothelial cells and help create an even more unique barrier. So the filter inside our kidneys is really just these glomerular capillaries and those podocyte helper cells. The fluid leaks out. What can leak out? Well, obviously the big stuff, red blood cells, white blood cells, and many of the plasma proteins are too big to leak out through the filtration barrier. But small stuff like water, sodium, chloride, calcium, glucose, bicarbonate, maybe even a little bit of albumin, and hormones and things, they're small enough to leak out of the barrier and leak out and into the filtrate. So once we form the filtrate, then what happens? Well, now we're going to actually process the filtrate by these little epithelial cells of the nephron. And if you remember, they're actually simple cuboidal cells. So as that filtrate makes its way through the nephron, we're going to actually process the fluid. So remember, we also need to reabsorb the things that the nephron grabs and processes. So we have two sets of capillaries which can do this, the peritubular capillaries and the vasorecta capillaries. So remember, our glomerular capillaries start the filtration process. Then the fluid snakes its way through the nephron, first in the proximal convoluted tubule, where the cells reabsorb things. Then we move on to the loop of Henle. From the loop of Henle, we move to the distal convoluted tubule. I mislabeled that. That's the distal convoluted tubule. And then finally, the end of the nephron is called the collecting duct. So all along the way, the little epithelial cells will grab things and reabsorb them. So let's look first at the actions of the proximal convoluted tubule. The little cells of the proximal convoluted tubule might be some of the most important of the nephron because they're going to reabsorb 70% or 2/3 of everything that filters will automatically be reabsorbed by the cells of the proximal convoluted tubule, including all of the glucose that actually filters. So that no glucose will normally end up in your urine because the proximal convoluted tubule cells grab it all. So they reabsorb 70% of everything: water, sodium, chloride, potassium, bicarbonate, all of it is automatically reabsorbed here in our proximal convoluted tubule. Those little cells make membrane proteins, which are either channels or transporters, which can grab things like glucose and amino acids, calcium, bicarbonate, and help shuttle them through so that they can be reabsorbed by your paratubular capillaries and vasorecta capillaries. Things like ions are reabsorbed, sodium, chloride, potassium, and then water is actually attracted to them by osmosis. So in this way, you can reabsorb water as well. So when we talk about the proximal convoluted tubule, we talk about bulk reabsorption because we're reabsorbing about 70% automatically. Next, we move to the loop of Henle. And the descending part of the loop of Henle is permeable only to water, so meaning those cells really only pick up water, and by osmosis, water flows out of the filtrate and into the tissue space of the kidney, and so that filtrate becomes really, really concentrated. As the filtrate moves up the loop of Henle, or the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, now the little cells are impermeable to water, but they have lots and lots of transporters and pumps that can pick up sodium and chloride and potassium. And so this part of the loop of Henle actually grabs lots and lots of ions and moves them into the spaces of the kidney. So this part is really, really important for actually now pulling ions out, and so now our filtrate is really dilute once it reaches the top of the loop of Henle. And this is also important to help pull the water out of the descending limb because we have this osmotic gradient or attraction to pull the water out. A lot of diuretics that doctors might prescribe you actually work on those little transporters and cells of the loop of Henle so that you end up peeing out lots of water and lots of ions. A drug might be called a diuretic. Next, we're in the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule helps fine-tune sodium and potassium levels, also pulling out things like calcium. And hormones are important in regulating the cells of the distal convoluted tubule. So, for example, aldosterone from your adrenal gland helps regulate sodium reabsorption there. Now we're at the very end of the nephron called the collecting duct, and the collecting duct is going to be really important in fine-tuning water reabsorption. So of the water that's left, we can decide whether we should pull that water out and get really, really concentrated urine. The hormone that helps regulate that is called antidiuretic hormone. It tells the little cells that we need to keep the water, and so they reabsorb the last bit of water. If at other times you don't have a lot of ADH hormone around, for example, if you just chugged a bunch of water, those little cells won't pick up the water, and instead the water will be excreted out, and you'll get a lot of urine formation that's really, really dilute because you're not reabsorbing that last bit of water. Again, the hormone is actually regulating this. When you consider that you have 2 million or so of these nephrons, each one involved in filtration and then processing and mostly reabsorption of all the good stuff, that's how your kidneys work. You have millions of these little nephrons and their associated blood vessels, and all day long they're processing and deciding what to keep in your body and what to get rid of. So remember, you have a GFR normally about 100 to 120 mils per minute. Your urine output, if you're not drinking a lot of water, can be as low as 1 mil per minute. If you're drinking a lot of water, that can spike up to much higher levels, and you can produce lots more urine. The next learning objective is to explain the basis of tests of renal function. So we have some blood tests and even some urine tests, which we can actually tell whether our kidneys are working well or not. So I wanted to make sure we could understand how those work. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this creatinine test. So remember that your muscles, when they use ATP and creatine phosphate to make ATP, they create a metabolic byproduct called creatinine. Creatinine then is made and circulates in your blood all the time, and our kidneys get rid of it all the time. And so if your kidneys are doing a good job, they'll filter the creatinine, and then of course it'll get excreted. If your kidneys are ever sick and not doing a very good job of filtering, that creatinine starts to build up in your blood instead of getting filtered and going out in your pee. So anytime you have increased plasma creatinine, it suggests that your kidney filtration is lower than normal or too low. And so now we have a blood test. We can test for plasma or serum creatinine. Whenever serum creatinine is too high, we know that our GFR must be too low, and then we can assume that our poor little kidneys aren't doing a very good job of working and filtering. All right, so the blood test is to test for creatinine. Sometimes you'll hear it called serum creatinine. Whenever creatinine is too high, that means our GFR is too low. And it's also interesting that doing this blood test of serum creatinine, you can actually estimate your GFR. And so you can actually go on an app or a computer and plug in your value and actually see what your GFR is. So you take your serum creatinine from your blood test, you plug it in along with your age and some questions about your ethnicity and gender, and you can actually see what your GFR is. The higher your serum creatinine, the lower your GFR is. So again, low GFR is bad because it means that your kidneys aren't doing a very good job of filtering. So a good one to remember is just about 100 mils per minute is a normal GFR. It decreases with age, so younger people should have probably higher than 100, and older people maybe a little bit lower. Another blood test that we can do for renal function actually tests for urea, which is a breakdown product, byproduct of protein metabolism. And so what we actually test for is blood urea nitrogen, or BUN. So again, the higher your BUN, or blood urea nitrogen, the lower your renal function. Again, it means that your kidneys aren't quite filtering very well. The urea or the creatinine are staying in your blood instead of getting filtered out and excreted in your urine. So again, when these are high, your GFR is actually low. Another thing I wanted to mention is albumin. So we can do a urine test to see if there is albumin or protein in your urine. Usually albumin either doesn't filter or it is filtered but reabsorbed, and so it should not end up in your urine. If it ends up in your urine, it usually means that your kidneys and the little filters are damaged, or you may be suffering from kidney failure. Exercise can sometimes cause this albumin to spike, which is actually not harmful. All right, so you may hear of things like proteinuria or albuminuria, and that has to do with albumin showing up in the urine in cases of kidney failure or kidney damage. So what causes kidney failure? A lot of things you've probably heard of, like hypertension, diabetes mellitus. Very common things can damage the glomerular capillaries, damage those filters, and cause kidney failure. All right, that's it. I will see you guys.